we have to have Chinese battery companies. Western EV makers, the big Western car companies, cannot even think about getting into the game unless they buy LFP batteries from Chinese companies. The US and Europe need to drop their ego a tad and get their act together, invite the Chinese into the United States, into Europe, learn from them how to make batteries, how to make cars, how to make software, and get that know-how here. And that is the way that they are going to get into the game.
Your trusted source for information on the energy transition. This is the Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. Welcome to another edition of the Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm Chris Sass, and with me is Niall Riddell. Today we have Steve LeVine with us. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Great to be here, Chris.
We're excited to have you on the podcast. Typically, I start these by asking our guests to give a little background of who they are so our audience knows who we're talking to today.
All right, great. So I'm editor of The Electric, which is a newsletter that looks at the whole battery and electric car space, from mines, nickel, lithium, so on, mines, all the way through to their processing, the components, batteries, electric cars, the big geopolitics, and it does so around the world. I'm a former foreign correspondent, so I tend to evaluate what we're looking at through the lens of the tension and the competition between China and the U.S. But also, there's quite a bit of tension here in the U.S., as you know, around electric cars right now. So that plays a big role too.
And batteries are absolutely crucial to both our energy ecosystem and the emerging electric vehicle revolution. How long have you been looking at batteries for, and where did that all begin?
I've been looking at batteries for about 14 years. So it began with an interest in oil, really. So I discovered through oil that was my prior obsession, that the industry itself is by far the largest industry in the world, and it's so big that it affects power. It affects the power of countries and how countries interact with one another. And if you watch oil, you can actually predict how global events are going to go to some extent. And so around 2010, I saw that China and the U.S. were both starting to dive into batteries as a space they both wanted to own. And remember, this is coming off the financial crash. This looked like an industry that if you owned it, it would be real economic traction for a country. And so that looked like this, the same as oil and geopolitics. So that's how I got into it, and I've kept looking at it since then.
So you're talking about the geopolitics of energy, and we can't have an energy conversation without politics. That it goes down to it. We've seen transitions before when navies switched from to oil. Do we see this kind of power play taking place? Do you see that around the world with battery technology? You mentioned China in particular, who's done a great job in taking solar power and becoming a leader there. Is this something that people should be fearful of and worried about from the geopolitics?
Yes, but in a way, first, it's not happening when Churchill instigated the switch from coal to oil back over 100 years ago. Like, that was right? It was a no-brainer because how much faster the fleets could go, and you saw that turnover happen very, very quickly around the world. Electric cars are not happening as quickly because they haven't persuaded everyone that it's as superior a system as oil was to coal or oil was to steam. But as this transition takes place, it is taking place. China's leading it, and it's something to be mindful of, in the sense that the West has entirely lost control of it. China grabbed a hold of it. The U.S. was in the game in 2010. It dropped its role in the game around 2012, 2013. That was around geopolitics, Democratic, Republican politics. And China kept going. It owns the space. China owns the 2020s, as the United States and Europe are trying to get in the game. It's trying to they're trying to get in the game for the 2030s. And what does it mean? It means that if we go on the current course, it means that in Europe, in the United States, what we're mostly going to be doing is buying Chinese electric cars that are powered by batteries made in China, and the batteries made by metals processed in Chinese factories. We're as it stands, we are. When I say we, I mean the West are out of the game, and so to the degree the United States and Europe make a sustained effort to get in that game, we can be part of the industry.
So if we go back to the beginning of a battery's journey, a battery really initiates from some fairly limited sets of raw materials which are mined out of the ground. Many of those mines do not exist in China. So this journey of where the raw material comes from and then moves forward is really, really crucial. What can you tell us about where the materials are coming from and how that supply chain does then ultimately end up in a Chinese battery factory?
Yeah. So China understood from the beginning that it did not have the main metals would be nickel, lithium, cobalt, manganese, and then minerals, graphite. So just those 4 or 5 minerals, and they're apart from graphite, China doesn't have any of those, or has small quantities of all those. But in the same way that Japan during the 1980s didn't have any oil, they imported and continue to import 98% of their oil. They were able to marshal the strengths that they do have and end up on top with China. Chinese companies backed by the Chinese government went around the world. Lithium triangle in South America, more recently to Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and Mali, grabbing control over the lithium supply, cobalt supply in the DRC, nickel supply in Indonesia and Australia, and took ownership stakes in these metals and all of those places, and then created a processing supply chain, all that raw material flowing into China, and then building the factories, expensive factories, big factories. This is not making chocolate chip cookies. This is like making cobalt sulfate, making NMC powders. This is a science. It's a science, and it's an art. and people who say, well, hey, I'm going to, open up a lithium hydroxide factory. All right, I mean, good for you, but it's not easy, and you're going to have to compete with the Chinese who have already been doing it for more than a decade. And so China has the commanding heights in batteries is ownership of the processing, the midstream, and China owns that.
And I've been very lucky. I've traveled a little bit, and I've been and seen some of the artisanal lithium mines in northern Chile, where local populations were extracting lithium, and I can imagine that that has fundamentally changed. And similarly, I've had the privilege of going out to Republic of Congo and meeting Chinese people very early on, this was 2008, looking for raw materials and locations. The Chinese have clearly thought this through very carefully. Do we just give up and go home as Western countries, or is there actually a role for us in this ecosystem, perhaps in the other end of the spectrum, maybe battery recycling?
Yeah. I mean, I'd be interested in your guys' opinion on this too. This is a subjective opinion that you're asking. Is it important for the West to have a competitive role to compete in electric cars and batteries, or just say, oh, let's go bowling and move on to AI, and we're going to own that space. I mean, I personally think that we do need to have a role. We do need to have our own assets, our own supply chain. And it doesn't mean they have to be in Europe, in the United States. It's you and all your allies. And by the way, that is potentially and should be the new geopolitics, right? That the West pulls together a chain of countries, lithium triangle. Why does China have to own the DRC? Why does China have to own Indonesia? Why are these countries provinces of China? Right? And so the U.S. has recently, by the way, made moves to whittle away at China's influence in the DRC. It has not done so in Indonesia, and Indonesia's role in nickel has resulted in a bunch of big Western nickel operations in Australia closing down. Is that and so that's not in the West's interest, and my answer to you is yes. We currently don't have much of a role, but we should have one, and there should be. I don't know if you're familiar with LFP. LFP is the iron lead cathode. That's the battery. It's the favored battery in China. The West has been extremely slow to move to that battery. I've been arguing for a long time. That's the best battery. That's the one we should be making. It has the fewest supply chain bottlenecks. It's the cheapest one. But the Western companies made a bet on nickel years ago and are having a lot of trouble getting their arms around changing their mind. But it would be strategically smart for the United States, for the EU, to say we're going to have LFP industries on our continents and put a lot of resources behind making that happen.
Yeah, so I think, sat here in Europe, are there any desirable electric cars to buy? Yes, there's lots. And I think one of the things that I think is quite intriguing about this conversation is we've had quite a few Chinese or Asian manufactured electric car companies try and start up here. NIO, Chery, VinFast, some of those have not made it. And I recently had the privilege of sitting through a presentation from someone who's represented a number of those brands, and he ended up with an interesting conclusion, which is it all comes down to what the consumer wants. And a lot of those consumers are still quite brand loyal. So as a consequence, the intuitive statement that Chinese electric cars are coming, they're cheaper, is really fascinating. But if you listen to McKinsey, they'll tell you the automotive OEMs have a different issue. That actually they're not able to integrate the software and the technology into the vehicles, and that's perhaps where the Chinese vehicle manufacturers have an additional edge. Is you get all the software and all the tech that you might not get in a legacy automotive vehicle.
Yeah. Yes. I think both of the things you said are correct. Like the Chinese automakers, I think BYD has had a little bit more luck than the others, but not a lot of luck. I mean, they're right, but they have come into Europe and assumed because they sell well in China that these same cars are going to sell well in the West, and they haven't found that to be the case. But the past shows us that they'll make course corrections. I mean, I think we can't underestimate that. The second thing you pointed out was the software. The reports you get out of China is that the Chinese are tech crazy, and so the distinguishing factor in their EVs are, what do they have inside for me to do? What's cool for me to do inside the car? And so that, they're filled with gizmos. You're right that Volkswagen has completely failed to create software. Herbert Diess lost his job because he failed to get Cariad to work correctly. Now has made a $5 billion bet on Rivian, solely to get Rivian's software system and adopt that into its own vehicle. So,
but the audio industry seems to have gone through this before. I remember in the 70s, 80s when the Japanese cars came into the market, and like Datsuns and Toyotas were these tinny rust buckets that nobody wanted. I mean, they were inexpensive. They came into our market. They weren't great. And then, a decade later, they dominated the market and they had U.S. plants, or maybe 2 decades later. But I mean, it's transformative. And then Kia, a Korean car maker, came out of nowhere, and they have EVs that people buy. In Europe, I had friends that drove them around when I lived in Europe. And so, I mean, I think we've seen the movie before. If you build a better mousetrap, people come, right? They like better vehicles. And the American auto industry's had to try to adapt to it in the past, right? There was a time when you thought all the big three were dead, and the Japanese car makers were going to take over, and they're still here today. There's no guarantee they'll be here in the future. But haven't we already seen this movie?
Yes, we have, and we're seeing it again. Chris, look at when you say that Ford and GM are still here. But in what form are they still here? They have become regional car makers. They're almost their whole businesses are North American businesses making big trucks and SUVs. Ford has given up making cars, sedans, and they make lots of money from these two segments. But Toyota is the second biggest car maker in the United States. It's 15% of the market. GM is just slightly ahead of it. Ford is behind, and so they're much shrunken. And so, okay, you say, all right, we've seen this movie before, and if the same movie plays out, we end up with Chinese car makers in the United States making electric cars, and the risk is that Ford and GM shrink further. Look, I don't have any dog in this fight. I've never had a relative working for Ford or GM. I don't own shares in any of those companies. But really, does it really matter? From whom Americans are buying cars? But I'm saying that the way the industry is going, the EV industry and the battery industry is going in a direction heavily dominated by the Chinese companies. And you do raise a super important point. Somehow, the South Koreans, Hyundai and Kia, have figured out the game, and their cars, their EVs are well loved, get in incredible reviews, and they're going to be a big part of this future.
So I briefly touched on this question earlier around, where could we play a role in the West? But I think one of the things that intrigues me about this whole conversation is clearly it's resource intensive. We're digging minerals out of the ground, we're manufacturing them, we're making big vehicles in many cases. What about the end of life as we proceed through that mineral extraction, battery fabrication, enter the EV, the whole debate there? Where do we see this second-hand or even recycling and reuse of batteries figuring into this plan? Is that an opportunity for the West to dominate and really showcase full circular lifestyles for these really important raw materials?
Okay, the first thing I want to say in response, I hope I haven't given the impression that it's hopeless for the West, for Western car makers. What I'm trying to say is they need to wake up and get their act together, and it's a long game. There has to be a sustained effort. It can't go on presidential administration cycles. We're doing it, then we're not doing it, and then we're doing it. There has to be a commitment made. We're going to get in this game. We're going to be part of the industry, and our car makers. It's not. That's a minority part. What the governments do. The major part is the car makers. The car makers themselves. If you don't want to copy BYD, copy Hyundai. Get your act together. It's not about the 2020s. It's about the 2030s and beyond. And in terms of recycling, that's one of the things that's raised. I think that's important. It's not important this decade because there has to be critical mass of batteries to recycle. Electric cars haven't been around long enough to generate that volume of those batteries. But in the 2030s, for sure, you're going to see what they call the circular economy of the batteries coming out of the cars and then being recycled, and then you end up having to mine a lot less nickel, a lot less lithium, and so on. So that is happening. Again, it won't surprise you. China is huge in this. In the West, we keep hearing, well, we're not going to go to LFP batteries like China because you can't recycle LFP. False. Chinese companies recycle LFP to get the lithium out of it. So it's a big game. It's a big game for the next decade.
All right, so we've gone all over the place in the conversation. You started with a strong announcement, basically talking how China has a lot of the supply chain and the minerals and all the things to go into the batteries, and they're playing the long game. We've talked a little bit about changing the EVs or the North American product to make a product the market wants, maybe, or upgrading the product so they remain relevant. You said all hope isn't lost. As we bring this together, what's the path forward? How do you think it will go, and how would you like it to go if it's different?
Okay, there's a caveat here. The caveat is it is so dangerous to predict. And this industry, we've had so many shifts that no one forecast. But the direction of things right now are that we have to have Chinese battery companies, Western EV makers. The big Western car companies cannot even think about getting into the game unless they buy LFP batteries from Chinese companies. Chinese companies make almost all the LFP around the world, so that goes without saying. So I do think we're going to have Chinese industry in the United States, in Europe, and we probably should, and we should drop a level our egos and be willing to learn from the Chinese and make sure that as part of that learning that the know-how, the know-how of how to make batteries at scale, efficiently, how to make the software at scale that really works, that has that pizzazz, gets transferred to the West. We have the U.S. This is not just rah-ing. The U.S. still has the edge on battery innovation and invention. All of these major batteries were invented in the United States by Americans, and then China, South Korea, Japanese grabbed those patents and they scaled them up. The next generation batteries are reaching scale in the United States. We need to hold on to them, scale them up here. So that that's just a smart move. I think that'll happen. I fear the politics, because for unknown reasons, we think that an inanimate object like a car is Republican or it's Democratic. They're not. They're inanimate objects. But because they take on this identity, then you get this erratic public policy. So I have optimism. I think we do end up with a balance of Western and Chinese companies in the U.S. and Europe. I do think I listened to Jim Farley, the CEO of Ford. He's made a series of public speeches and also appearances on other people's podcasts. You guys should have him on, and he understands everything that I've said today. He obviously gets, and it's a matter of doing it. And they have, by the way, Ford. He talks about a skunk works. He's got this secret skunk works in Los Angeles somewhere where they are a separate entity from Ford. Like his card to get into the building does not work at the skunk works. They are veterans of Tesla, Rivian, Apple, and they are creating like an adjunct to Ford. There in the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see, he says, right? See EVs come out of there. He says completely different from what Ford Inc. has produced, with different methods. That I'm super interested to see what they come up with.
Steve, this is fascinating. You've given us an insight as to how China is shaping our marketplace, both in the US and here in Europe. You've given us an insight and a tour as to where you think this might go next, and you've given us hope that as long as we all sit up and listen, there is an opportunity for us to ensure that we are part of this future. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Neil. Thanks, Chris, for having me.
For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Insider's Guide to Energy. If you have, don't forget to like, don't forget to comment if you agree, you disagree, add comments, get the conversation going. We'll see you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy. Bye for now.